Welcome to China in Focus. I'm Tiffany Meyer. Our top story, Chinese warships popping up in waters near Alaska. The sighting just 2 days before the kickoff of the NATO summit in Washington for the world's most powerful military alliance.
The Chinese are telling us that they are able to find a path to assisting new wars against NATO.
4 Chinese vessels spotted in Taiwanese waters, while 66 Chinese aircraft take to the skies near the island, all in just 1 day. That's as a Chinese carrier passes by Taiwan and the Philippines as it heads for a drill in the Pacific. As NATO wraps up its summit, the alliance agrees on one clear goal: stop Chinese aid to Russia's war. The 32 member nations inked a pact labeling China a, quote, decisive enabler of Russia's invasion. How did China respond? And a rally, a march, and a candlelight vigil. Congress members and religious freedom groups joined practitioners of Falun Gong at the nation's capital to call for an end of the Chinese Communist Party's unprecedented persecution of faith. Before we dive into today's top story, we have some announcements to share. NTD's Fiona G will be sitting in for me on China in Focus from July 15th to the 18th. Next week, NTD's Steve Lance and I will bring you live special coverage of the Republican National Convention. Former President Trump is expected to be officially nominated as the 2024 Republican presidential candidate at the event. Take a look.
The biggest Republican event of the year. 4 nights. Thousands under one roof, officially nominating their candidate for president.
America's comeback starts right now.
Watch NTD's live special coverage with Steve Lance and Tiffany Meyer on The Nation Decides 2024. Republican National Convention, 6 p.m. Eastern from July 15th through the 18th on NTD News.
Watch our special coverage of The Nation Decides 2024 next week, Monday through Thursday at 6 p.m. Eastern. 4 Chinese warships inching closer to U.S. waters in Alaska. 4 Chinese warships showed up near Alaska last weekend. The U.S. Coast Guard disclosed the information Wednesday. The Chinese ships were in international waters, but still inside the U.S. Exclusive Economic Zone, or EEZ. The zone spans 200 nautical miles from the U.S. shoreline. U.S. Coast Guard cutters first spotted 3 Chinese warships over 120 miles from the tip of Alaska. They later noticed a 4th ship further away. The Chinese ships told the U.S. Coast Guard via radio that they were conducting freedom of navigation operations. The U.S. Coast Guard ship monitored the Chinese ships until they left. The encounter comes 2 days ahead of NATO summit in Washington. NATO is the world's most powerful military alliance. Leaders of the alliance said Wednesday that Beijing poses systemic challenges to the Europe-Atlantic security. They also said China is a decisive enabler of Russia's war on Ukraine. On the eve of the NATO summit, Beijing kicked off drills with Belarus near the border of Poland, a NATO member. A Chinese aircraft carrier also passed close to the Philippines and Japan on its way to a drill in the Pacific. Back to U.S. Coast Guard ship encounters with Chinese warships, the encounter wasn't a first. Last year, at least 11 Chinese and Russian naval ships sailed near Alaska. The U.S. sent 4 warships and an aircraft to shadow them. They didn't enter U.S. territorial waters and later left. In 2022, a U.S. Coast Guard ship spotted a Chinese missile cruiser in the Bering Sea. And in 2021, U.S. Coast Guard ships encountered 4 Chinese warships off a group of Alaskan islands. The ships were operating in international waters, but again, within the U.S. Exclusive Economic Zone. Next, let's zoom in on a string of Chinese activities that are putting Taiwan on alert. Footage shows Chinese Coast Guard ships entering territorial waters around Kinmen, a Taiwanese island that's tucked into the coast of China.
You have entered the prohibited waters of the Republic of China, seriously damaging the peace and stability of the area.
Taiwan said it's watching the Chinese military closely. 66 Chinese fighter jets flew near Taiwan Thursday morning. Some of them were on their way to join a Chinese aircraft carrier for a drill in the Pacific. That Chinese carrier passed close to the Philippines and Japan on its way. Taiwanese President William Lai said Beijing's intrusions into the Taiwan Strait are increasing day by day. He pledged to continue to bolster the island's defenses. Just last week, Chinese officials seized a Taiwanese fishing boat near Kinmen and took it to a Chinese port. Beijing sees Taiwan as part of China, despite never having ruled it. The Chinese regime has also pledged to take it under control by force if necessary. The U.S. doesn't have formal diplomatic ties with Taiwan, but is bound by law to sell weapons to the island so it can defend itself. Zooming in on the Chinese carrier putting Japan, Taiwan, and the Philippines on alert. It first got close to Japan on Tuesday. Japan sent 2 Navy ships out to observe the carrier's movements and sent out fighter jets to respond to the Chinese warplanes launched by the carrier. Early Wednesday morning, Taiwan detected the carrier along with dozens of military aircraft. Taiwan's defense ministry said the carrier was sailing close to the Philippines. The Philippines military said it was concerned. Manila has long opposed China's territorial claims in the South China Sea. A 2016 international court ruled out Beijing's claims invalid. There is another maritime skirmish between China and Japan. On Thursday, Beijing's foreign ministry took issue with Tokyo over a Japanese vessel entering Chinese water. According to a Japanese news agency, a Japanese destroyer briefly sailed into China's eastern maritime territory last Thursday. China's spokesperson said, according to Japan, the entry was due to a technical error and that Japan is investigating the intention of the move. Chinese vessels seem to be everywhere in recent days, from Coast Guard ships seen entering territorial waters around a Taiwanese island to 4 Chinese military ships spotted near Alaska, closing in on United States territory. What is the goal of Beijing's display? We spoke to Rick Fisher, senior fellow at the International Assessment and Strategy Center, for his take. Rick Fisher, thank you so much for joining us. Great to have you back on the show.
Tiffany, thank you for having me back.
Now, 4 Chinese naval ships have been spotted around Alaska's islands. Now, they're sailing in international waters, but they are inside the U.S. Exclusive Economic Zone, or EEZ. What do you make of that?
This is a regular probe by the Chinese Navy, by the People's Liberation Army Navy, of American defenses. In late 2023, a joint Chinese and Russian naval group sailed to a similar location not far from the Aleutian Islands. These islands are important for the United States. They're our most westernmost appendage, closest to Russia. We have some important radar facilities on the Aleutian Islands. The much larger picture is that as the Chinese and Russian alliance develops, that they could actually threaten multiple forms of military activity against Alaska. Not to mention, China is building up its submarine force very rapidly at the moment.
Now, give that aside, today is the last day of the NATO summit in Washington, D.C. How likely are these Chinese ships related to that?
Well, very much so. The dictatorship alliance, China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea, and now Belarus, are plotting coordinated activities in the coming months and years to tie down the United States and the democratic allies. The Chinese are telling the NATO allies and the Americans the very week that they celebrate the 75th anniversary of 75 years of cooperation between the NATO allies here in Washington, the Chinese are telling us that they are able to find a path to assisting new wars against NATO.
Rick Fisher, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Tiffany.
Tensions between democracies and authoritarian nations reaching new highs. On Thursday, President Biden and his NATO allies are set to talk with partners from the Asia-Pacific and Ukraine to discuss how to counter threats posed by China, Russia, and North Korea. Leaders from all 32 NATO countries inked a declaration on Wednesday condemning China for its no-limits aid to Russia during the war. Here's the NATO Secretary General in Washington.
As NATO allies agreed today in our summit declaration, China has become a decisive enabler of Russia's war against Ukraine. And China's support increases the threat Russia poses to Euro-Atlantic security. Allies have stated clearly that China cannot enable the largest conflict in Europe in recent history without this negatively impacting their interest and reputation.
That's the harshest comment ever from NATO to China. NATO now requires that Beijing cease all material and political support to Russia's war effort, including materials that can be used to make weapons. On top of that, NATO accused China of challenging the security of NATO countries through systematic cyber attacks and spreading disinformation. The body also called out Beijing for its efforts to divide the alliance. Although no country was mentioned specifically, NATO member Turkey recently said it's eager to join a security forum led by China and Russia. China rejected NATO's criticism the next day, accusing the declaration of creating tension and chaos in the Indo-Pacific region. It also accused the body of being plagued by, in Beijing's words, Cold War mentality. At the same time, the Chinese military is holding joint exercises with a close Russian ally, Belarus. The drills will span 11 days and are taking place just miles from the border of a NATO member, Poland. A brutal persecution of a peaceful spiritual meditation practice. This July 20th marks the 25th year since the Chinese Communist Party began its bloody oppression campaign targeting Falun Gong, also known as Falun Dafa. Adherents of the faith held a grand rally at the nation's capital to commemorate lost lives and raise awareness. NTD's Washington correspondent Jack Bradley brings us more from Capitol Hill.
Thousands of Falun Gong practitioners and their supporters are gathering here in the nation's capital to commemorate 25 years of the persecution of Falun Gong. Falun Gong, also known as Falun Dafa, is a spiritual practice based on truthfulness, compassion, and forbearance, and it's persecuted heavily in China. In 1999, the Chinese regime recorded up to 100 million people practicing Falun Dafa in China. That's when the regime launched the persecution against anyone practicing.
We've seen 25 years of oppression. We've seen things such as extrajudicial killing, imprisonment, this terrible crime of the harvesting of human organs that's been well documented by our organization in peer-reviewed journal articles.
And while the focus of the CCP's organ harvesting brutality has now shifted to the Uyghurs and other persecuted predominantly Muslim groups in the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region, let us not forget that this crime was first directed at Falun Gong practitioners. Once again, the Falun Gong were the canaries in the coal mine, if anyone was paying attention, warning us of the true nature of the communist regime. It is the persecution that you suffer that reveals the true nature of the regime.
I spoke to a few of the speakers here at the rally as well. Let's hear what they had to say.
I served in the U.S. Army, and so much of why I fought and risked my life in combat was for this core human principle of freedom, and freedom to believe and practice one's faith with and in community that has been so directly attacked by the Chinese Communist Party and getting worse and worse. So that's a value, that is an American value as we stand here looking at our capital. And so we need every American and every freedom-loving person around the world to stand in solidarity with the Falun Gong community.
What can people watching at home do to help support practitioners who are facing this brutal persecution?
Well, this is what's so important. This has to be a national and a global movement to raise awareness and then to take action to hold the CCP accountable. This is not just a problem and transgression against the Falun Gong. It should be against all freedom-loving people.
This comes just 2 weeks after the House passed the Falun Gong Protection Act, which sanctions any individual involved in the Chinese regime's forced organ harvesting. Now, forced organ harvesting has been a main problem targeting the Falun Gong practitioners, and we can see that Congress and officials are standing up more and more to the Chinese Communist Party's persecution of Falun Gong. Reporting from Washington, D.C., Jack Bradley, NTD News.
That's all for today's China in Focus on YouTube. We're now sharing a shortened version of our program here after being demonetized for 3 years. If you'd like to support us, consider donating. Find us at donorbox.org/China-in-focus or subscribe to our partner platform Epic TV, where you can watch our full episodes. Just click the link down below. Here's what to look out for in our second half. 25 years of brutal persecution against a peaceful faith. Hear the heartfelt stories of those who survived and those who didn't amid the Chinese Communist Party's unprecedented campaign. Mexican naval officials say they are worried about dangerous dual-use chemicals entering the country's largest ports from China. Those substances used to make harmful and illicit drugs. And OpenAI blocking users in China from accessing its software, but services remain open through Microsoft's Azure cloud. More on the details after the break here on China in Focus. Thanks for watching China in Focus. I'm Tiffany Meyer. See you tomorrow.